Here we are on this the Tracks and Traces reading group, and we're engaging with Paul's chapter on Baptist understandings of salvation, which is chapter 10. And he starts with Pilgrim's Progress, and a couple of times through the chapter makes reference to that and John Bunyan's a famous account. But where he begins in the chapter is this understanding of saving faith he talks about, and he means by that a direct individual response to the grace offered by God in Christ. And he sees that, Baptists have had this understanding of saving faith. He talks about, he makes reference to the Baptist Doctrine of the Church, published by the Baptist Union Council in 1948 in Great Britain, where he says that this saving faith can come swiftly and emotionally, or it can come slow. It can be slow developing and undramatic, recognizing that our journey to encounter God in Christ and encountering that saving faith can come in different ways. And then he picks up Henry Whelan Robinson, that sometimes it can be like he understands it as the kind of the dawning of the light, an understanding of the knowledge that we have salvation in God in Christ. He then moves on to say that Baptists are obviously children of the Reformation, and especially been shaped by Calvin and others. And so what does this saving faith, though, mean for Baptists, perhaps within that, within the many children of the Reformation, where he'll talk about, first of all, four things. And he says personal faith. For Baptists, this saving faith is personal, and that's seen in baptism of believers, rather than any other kind of baptism. It's the believer having that personal faith practiced in baptism. And then secondly, a kind of church kind of point. Well, it means that the church is always a fellowship of believers, that we are those who believe in this saving faith, and that constitutes the church as being a fellowship of those who believe. Thirdly, he wants to say, a consequence of this understanding of saving faith is an understanding of freedom of conscience, that belief and faith cannot be coerced or pressed on anybody. It has to come freely in response to what God has done, an individual response freely made. And then fourthly, what does this mean for Baptists? Well, it means that we have been prominent in evangelism and mission. We want people to know and respond individually to have this saving faith, and so we proclaim the gospel in that way. So those are the kind of four ideas he wants to say as a consequence of this emphasis on saving faith that Baptists have had. But then he moves into a section of wanting to say that this emphasis on the individual also needs to be balanced by the sense of the community. It's not just the individual response is always held in a wider context of the community. And so he wants to talk about baptism being both individual but also ecclesial. We're baptized into the church. We're not just baptized into a relationship just directly with God without any significance of anybody else. He also wants to say that if we understand this personal salvation is always being gathered by Christ into the church, into a community. It's Christ who's doing this act of gathering again. So we might talk about saving faith and that individual response, but there's something of Christ taking the first step of gathering us in, that we might come to that understanding in that way. And then thirdly, he wants in this section to talk about for Baptists, this understanding of saving faith often leads to and generally leads to an understanding of social reform and justice. So there's a kind of real sense of salvation having a social aspect, a justice aspect, and not just this kind of individual me and God thing going on, as he sees it in the tradition. In the next section, he wants to talk about two things then, which is salvation is always dependent upon the grace of God. It's always something that's enabled, initiated by the grace of God, at the same time as having this sense of a human response. It's these two emphases, and he'll come back to this at the end of the chapter, which he sees within the Baptist tradition, this sense of election and free will. The mystery of election he talks about, but also the free kind of human response to that. And a Baptist understanding of salvation, as he reads it in the tradition, has always been wanting to hold those two ideas together: God's grace, election, and the human response and they come together. And then he has a quote on page 239, which thought was where he talks in his own voice. He's been talking about tradition, but then he says, where does he say it now? For myself, halfway down 239, I believe that we shall only begin to see how this kind of grace and human free will converge if we abandon the view that grace is irresistible. We need, I suggest, a vision of a God who is humble enough to have a gracious offer of life rejected, even of a God who will work by the Holy Spirit in the depths of the human heart, wooing human beings to respond, and who is still willing to be spurned. It might be that we want to come back and say whether that's a view that we all share, or what, if there's a problem with that. So that where he talks, I believe that that grace perhaps is not irresistible. He then comes back, and the book is obviously picking up different ideas here. So we come back to the kind of sense of conversion and baptism being a process, not just a kind of thunderbolt lightning moment. It's something that we're on a journey of, and salvation is kind of understanding of that journey. And so again in 241 he says, let me see if I can find it, understanding. I made a note of the first few words, but I didn't thinking I'd quickly be able to understanding, again halfway down that page, understanding salvation as a process like this would also begin to break down the neat distinction made at the time of the Reformation between justification and sanctification, an issue that has divided Protestant and Catholic theology since that time. So this again, what do we make of that sentence? Again, it was a sentence that jumped out at me in some kind of way. The next section, personal salvation and theology of atonement, from page 242, wants to pick up the title of a book that he wrote on the doctrine of atonement, past event and present salvation. How do we hold these two ideas together? The sense that what Jesus does on the cross is objective, but our response is always kind of a subjective. It's a response that we make to that objective event of the cross, and wanting to hold these two ideas together. And he sees this is perhaps the particular Baptist contribution to a theology of salvation or atonement. Where does he say that? Again, I've lost. Oh, it's 245, isn't it? Yeah. So it may be, I suggest, second paragraph 245, a particular Baptist contribution to atonement theology to affirm the enduring of sin and divine wrath by Christ, the Calvinist tradition, while also affirming the central place of human response and human transformation, the Arminian tradition. And so, although there are these two traditions within the Baptist story, at least in the English and probably the American accounts, he wants to see, actually, if we bring these two together, the Calvinist and Arminian, we have this kind of particular contribution. If we bring together this objective and subjective, the past and the present together, there is something that perhaps Baptists might make in some particular way. He ends that section by with this sentence on page 246. We might, I suggest, spell out this enabling of response in several ways, this response to God's objective act of salvation. He talks then about the power of the story. He talks about the effect of the individual being a kind of part of a community, and above all, he talks about it's our experience of God's own sacrificial love and that power to break open. Yes, so it's in the act of salvation, in the cross, God draws us near to us here and now to offer this forgiveness. And so he says that this vision that he's got, or this understanding of salvation, holding together election and response, grace and free will, kind of is practiced by the church in the telling of the story, in the power of that narrative, in the experience of being part of the church, but it's also that kind of direct encounter, that direct experience of God, which he sees focused in the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. And again, we might want to have a discussion about what we make of that, and whether we think that there's some problems there, or if that's helpful in some particular way. I kind of like it when he talks about in the final part of the book, the final bit of this chapter. He talks about the spirit, a kind of spiritual cocktail of dashes of Calvinism and Arminianism, and that's what he sees in this Baptist tradition. That's the argument that he's been making. The consequences of all this was where he ends the chapter with this idea of the breadth of salvation. Well, Baptists then have an understanding of the universal church, that those who are redeemed go beyond perhaps those just in the Baptist church. There's a Catholic wider view he sees coming out of this understanding of salvation. It's a view that is able to include children, even if they haven't made that response as yet, because they're already within the kingdom. And he also says there's something ecumenical here about this. If we take these ideas forward, that was what I kind of captured my reading of this chapter. And it might be that we want to go back and pick up some of those particular sentences that at least jumped out at me. So I wonder, what did you make of the chapter? What bits kind of engaged you? What questions did it raise? You think this is a helpful chapter? I think, you know, what he is doing, I guess, as a final thought, is he's definitely wanting to kind of engage with the Baptist tradition here. This is a tracts chapter again, but also I guess he's making this kind of traces argument with his particular idea of bringing the Calvinism and Arminianism together, the election and the free will, the grace and the human response. So there's both those ideas running through this chapter.
So, Andy, just as a clarification question, is there a sort of earlier documentary history to this chapter? Was it an article before it was revised and became part of in this chapter in this book?
So he says here that in the preface that it was a version of a paper published in a book called For Us and For Our Salvation, 7 Perspectives on Christian Soteriology. So I guess he was asked to write it for that. And I guess he was asked to write it because of obviously his work in past and present salvation. Paul's often asked to write about salvation. He's got a chapter in the Oxford Handbook to Systematic Theology on Salvation. He's been, I guess, one of the go-to people. Well, to be honest, he's a go-to person for anyone trying to edit a book and wanting to get a Baptist perspective. But yes, so the book. So I think that book came out in '95, and he originally gave it in '93. He says, but I think really he's working with the ideas that past and present salvation that book has in it, and he's just tracing that in the Baptist kind of account, which I guess might want to say that that book, Past and Present Salvation, is very much, he writes that as a Baptist, which wouldn't be perhaps conscious of if you read the book. He doesn't really make a lot of it, but he's pulling together this idea of the Calvinism and Arminianism in that book to a certain extent, I think. He says, not having read it for quite a long time. But I think those two ideas are running through, and he wanting to say that that's a Baptist contribution to understandings of salvation and atonement.
Past and present salvation is from '89, it looks like.
Yeah.
From the
yeah.
Andy, do you think that he's saying this is a Baptist distinctive to bring these two together? Do you think he's saying that is true throughout the history of Baptist theology, or he's proposing that it should be the distinctive? I wasn't quite sure, because he makes the point that today you've got, I think he talks page 243 about the Puritan Calvinist heritage in Baptist life today is so strong that many Baptists would assume that penal substitution is the only understanding of atonement. But he then also says, of course, that most Baptist churches unthinkingly have a fairly open view of who can belong. And so they are kind of Arminian by default, by accident. So I'm just wondering whether he thinks that this combination has been rooted throughout history, or whether he's just saying, well, actually, this is a structure by which we can think about it, and it should be the way we think about it.
Yeah, I don't think he's wanting to say it's there from the beginning amongst all Baptists, partly because one is very Calvinist and one is Arminian.
Yeah,
particular argument is actually to say there may be a Baptist contribution to try and bring these together. And as I guess, and you see this, I guess, in his argument, at least from the 20th century, we see these two Baptists become, I guess, those who are more Calvinist particular become less fussed about Arminianism, and those who are Arminian become less fussed a bit about these two ideas. So I think he's doing some creative theology here, which I don't think goes against what Baptists have said, but he wants to say actually there's something creative we can do by bringing an understanding of election and human free will together to bring Calvinism and Arminianism together.
Okay, yeah.
And it does seem to me that actually most Baptists today are fairly Arminian, really. We've lost that. But while still perhaps holding on to a kind of penal substitution kind of Calvinist.
That's my point.
that thing. But we do want to say that people have to respond to the gospel, in that way. And I think there's less, I don't know, Derek, you may know more, but in mainstream Baptists, so Baptist Union of Great Britain, I would say that most don't have an understanding of limited atonement. They'd have a more kind of Arminian understanding of Jesus died for everybody, but they need to respond to it. Yeah.
I mean, I would say in the United States, generally, yes. I think for American Baptists, this has to do with the Second Great Awakening, sort of waves of revivals that sort of became sort of hallmarks of most Baptists, like that kind of shape of religion, I think. So for us, it's the emergence of what we call the separate Baptists, and which are more revivalistically oriented and are more evangelistically inclined. That's really sort of practice driving theology, though, in historical sense. I mean, the story that Paul tells here is usually is centered around Andrew Fuller and William Carey.
Yeah.
And that missions piece is, I think, the consistent thread that sort of is where the merge happens, where certain Calvinism makes its peace with missions, and I think that's a key piece. Though, I mean, there's still a fair number of hyper Calvinists that exist in Carey's time that sort of don't get on that train.
Yeah.
In the United States, we have a revival of Calvinism that in the Baptist movement, usually in very, very conservative Baptist denominations. I'm not sure if that exists in the same way in the UK. And I have to think some about how it affects, if it affects in interest or enthusiasm for missions. I have to think about that a little bit, about whether that pans out in that way.
I think, and I think, as you say, the Great Awakening, I think that's the same. It is Andrew Fuller, but then from the General Baptist side, it's Dan Taylor. And actually, it's interesting, is it? Paul doesn't talk about evangelicalism, which is the impact. I think that shifts Baptists in a way that, by the time we get to, in the English account of the particular Baptists coming together, they're not actually that fussed about Calvinism or Arminianism. They are fussed about other issues, but that's kind of, we're all evangelical. We're all committed to conversion, to the Bible, to the cross. But Paul kind of doesn't really engage at that kind of level. For him, it's still wanting to say, hey, this is a Baptist thing, which I think the impact of evangelicalism on Baptist life, both in the US and the UK, is huge, and we're still living with that legacy.
Well, and with that, and this is just from a broader comment, and that's kind of a shift in the Baptist story, where instead of being against something, dissenters and sort of as the primary mode of identity, you're part of something bigger, and that part of something bigger is what's sort of shaping who you are, and so you're trying to fit into that thing as opposed to trying to distinguish yourself from it.
Yeah,
and I think that's seems to be at least something of a piece of this as well. Both, at least in the United States. Baptists and Methodists in the United States, they have different forms of life, but they're doing the same kind of thing, and they're spread across the United States in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, sort of in the same mode, for the same reason.
Yeah. And I guess, what is Paul doing with this chapter in this book? I think he's also wanting to say to Baptists who generally don't know their history, and who may not think that theologically about salvation. Here is our tradition, and here actually we need to engage with with the theological conversation between Calvinism and Arminianism, between election and free will. Baptists have done, and actually we have perhaps something particular to our story that we can offer into that conversation. Would be my kind of take of what he's trying to do, perhaps here.
Yeah, he does make the point, doesn't he? And I'm sure he's right that presumably most Baptists in UK churches haven't got a clue that there were two types before the PUGB.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wondered what you made of that sentence where he, on page 239, which I quoted, "For myself, I believe that we shall only begin to see how this kind of grace and human free will converge if we abandon the view that grace is irresistible." Is he right? I have in my mind, I think this is the right phrase from Karl Barth, the impossible possibility of rejecting God's grace. Whereas Paul seems to be quite happy with that human beings may end up resisting God's grace. What he doesn't actually spell out what the consequences of that might be, but and I don't know, maybe he does in The Promised End or something, but he doesn't do that here. Yeah, Julian, and then Gareth.
Well, I can remember a tutorial with Paul about this topic, and he was certainly clear in his mind that he could envisage the possibility of people choosing to resist God and exclude themselves from God's fellowship for eternity. I think he would argue that God doesn't give up, but nonetheless it's conceivable, if we take human free will and relationship that is entered into mutually seriously, that's a real possibility.
Yeah, and I guess he is working there with his understanding of God, creative suffering idea of God is vulnerable, which again is a Fiddes view of God, which wouldn't be shared by everybody. Yeah, Gareth, did you want to?
I think Julian's just expressed what I was about to say, or something along the lines of what I was about to say. It was one of the very few bits that I made a note of about grace not being irresistible. And the comment I got down there is, must think a little bit more about this.
See, I'm not sure if there's some latent Calvinism in me which wants to say I'm not sure. But, well, I don't know if that is a Calvinism actually, because I wouldn't hold to a limited atonement, but yeah.
So forgive me, why would grace not be irresistible? Because I read that and didn't think of that as being particularly controversial, but obviously that reflects my theological ignorance, probably.
Well, I guess I'm with, well, and Barth doesn't push this, but he kind of just makes the comment of the impossible possibility that we might end up rejecting God. I think it's that I'm not sure if that could ever be. But then if we take, I guess my other thing is I'm not sure how free human beings really are. And I'm always a bit suspicious when we overplay human free will, because I think it's shaped by so many things. I don't know, Derek, I don't know if you've got
Actually, I was just trying to process Tim's question, because I was just trying to it was the negatives. So in this sentence, it's later on, it's a Sunday afternoon, and I'm like, so why would grace not be irresistible? I was like, okay, so how do I rephrase that?
I was just trying to think. So he's saying we need to abandon the view that grace is irresistible. And I was just asking, why is that so controversial? So, because in my mind, I don't think the idea that God's grace is All right, let me think a little bit more about that.
So I guess it's the Calvinist tradition says if you're elect, you're elect.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah,
You know, and you've got no choice about, you know, that.
Isn't
And whereas Paul was, sorry.
Well, I was gonna say, isn't this also about God's freedom to some extent? That sort of God's free to act as God chooses, and so, or God decides, and so, if grace is irresistible, if God freely offers a gift that is not received, then God is somehow not affecting what God has chosen to affect, right? I mean, I think it's what some people would say.
Mm. Mm.
I'm not saying I agree with that perspective. I'm just saying I think it's partly what's at the heart of it is sort of how we understand God, not just salvation and election, right?
Yeah.
Which is where Bart sort of jumps in, right? Bart, this is about God's freedom all the way down.
Mm. Mm.
I mean, partly Paul is declaring here that he's not a universalist in the sense that not all of the cosmos and not every human being is necessarily going to be reconciled to God.
Yeah.
And there are some theological perspectives within the wider church that are explicitly universalist, and they can't envisage that anyone would ultimately freely choose not to be reconciled to God.
Mm.
And I think Paul is taking seriously the notion that as human beings, we can choose how we're going to ultimately respond to God.
Mm.
And that's not a comfortable position for some people, particularly if they're committed to an absolute form of universalism.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Mm.
I mean, Andy, you asked what we thought about it. I find myself sympathetic to Paul's perspective because I think it does recognize the persistent grace and determination of God to reconcile all of creation and all of humanity to him, but at the same time acknowledges that a truly relational account of salvation requires that ultimately human beings can choose not to be with God.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Julian, your comment about universalism is just really fascinating. And honestly, not because you said it, it was just because in the context, it surprised me a bit in a way that usually those that hold to irresistible grace that fits into a larger system as we're talking about, which runs against the grain of universalism, right? So it's sort of because this is in the tulip, right? So this is and so that to abandon that idea would move in the direction of, or to run against the grain of universalism is a really interesting thing to think about.
Mm.
I think in part it is an echo of a fact or a point that was acknowledged in earlier episodes of our conversation, that Paul has written largely in an ecumenical context where he will be encountering a range of denominational perspectives, and within those denominational perspectives a range of theologies of all types. And so he is, I think he's simply trying to set out as clearly as possible his own perspective, but in conversation, although it may not be explicitly stated here, with other points of view on salvation that he will be encountering or has encountered.
Mm. Mm. Brian.
I think, as I mentioned last time, I'm involved at the moment in a on-the-ground situation with a congregation. I had a pretty practical and good conversation during last week with the minister who said he wanted to come and have a chat. I've been drinking very deeply at the wells in my old age of progressive and process thinking. I have been trying to wrestle with Calvin in his institutes. I've also been listening and watching on YouTube some of the differences in the preachers in the US, and looking at wide differences between John MacArthur, John Piper, and also people like Brian McLaren and Richard Rohr. I'm also delving quite deeply into Paul's participation with God. And it just makes me wonder whether we've reached a point in the whole sort of scope of theological church thinking, whether the theology that we do, how do we translate that down to the people in pews who are wondering what on earth it's all about? And yeah, Paul's approach in his thinking, and I've thought that for a long time, reading some of those other books like Past and Present Salvation, the creative suffering of God, and particularly now wrestling with participating in God. And also I've been rereading J.V. Taylor's The Christ-like God. I've got so much going in my head. I think I've got to pack so much in my old age while I can still think. And out of that, I'd like to just throw a question in. We're talking about salvation. We're talking about those approaches from the Calvinistic view and the Arminian view, the different Christus Victor and the penal substitution and Peter Abelard's view and all those. But can I just ask the question, what are we saved for? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
A nice big question there, Brian, for us. Yeah. I guess from Paul's point of view would be that we're saved to participate in the divine life. You know, that would be that. I would suggest that would be his vision, and not as individuals again, but in an ecclesial sense or it would have a community sense. I think about that as well. But yeah. This chapter again is quite a strange one, I think, in the book, because you know it's, and you partly wonder, it's kind of I had this chapter lying around. It's on Baptist views of salvation. I might as well stick it in the book, kind of thing, because you know, the rest of the chapters have been very kind of ecclesial, kind of focused, and here we have this chapter which is a bit, I guess, a bit more doctrinal. Although I think the way that Paul does the chapter is he takes us all the way back again into kind of ecclesial kind of questions and in terms of baptism and other things. So he's still doing that kind of work. Yeah. James, you've been very quiet. I wonder what you made of the chapter.
My brain isn't working this evening, so I'm not making a lot of anything. My struggle with Paul, anytime I read him on salvation, does come back to this question about the relationship between objective and subjective models of atonement. And I can't help but wonder if he just ends up collapsing the objective into the subjective. He says a couple of times, you know, what is achieved objectively on the cross is essentially the subjective response that it creates in us. And there's so all those classic models of atonement, Christus Victor, penal substitution, whilst there might be a place for them, that's not the important thing for him. And I wonder if he goes too far in that direction. I think he's right in saying we need a balance of both, but I wonder if he kind of smuggles the objective side of it out the back door a bit to focus on the subjective.
Yeah. And I guess that was what was making me wonder when he talked about on 246. He talks about the past event of the cross is as an objective act of salvation, but then it enables this response, and he goes into story, he goes into the sense of being part of the church, he goes into our experiences. It moves quite quickly from the event, it seems to be, into the present, which I think is your point, James. And I guess that does raise. I wasn't sure how I want to respond to it, but it doesn't feel entirely satisfactory, which I think is perhaps what you're saying.
I go on, Tim. Sorry.
I need to say I'm glad you said that, James, because I can't remember when I read Past Event, Present Salvation, a long time ago now, but I remember that you just said disappointed, I think, Andy, or dissatisfied. I remember being disappointed when I read it, because I kind of felt, I was hoping for something really revealing that would marry these two together, and it felt to me it ended up in a subjective position. I can remember thinking, was that it? Is that where we've ended up? Just evoking the response, even though it was a significant, a one-time event, and yet it's only to provoke the response in us. So yeah, I'm only saying I agree with the dissatisfaction or the concern, perhaps.
I wonder, is that conclusion, the conclusion Paul arrives at, kind of inevitable, given his understanding of the whole of creation always participating in God, even those aspects of creation which are rejecting God are still participating him in a metaphysical sense? And so where is there to go with atonement if you've landed on that view? Because kind of the only barrier between us and God is the one in our minds. Then is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, and I guess there may be some influence here of Wheeler Robinson again, just that sense of a light dawning, and yeah. But I wonder if it also raises again the question of where's the Christology here? But I think he doesn't. I think there is something to talk about in terms of the past and the present. I think he's right to name it. It's whether we, because there is something about this. The cross is an event that happens 2,000 years ago. How does that affect us now in the present? But I guess it feels like it's too in the past, and I want to make the cross more present. But I'm not theologically clever enough to work all that out. But
sorry, go on.
Wouldn't Paul say that the crucified and risen Jesus is the one who connects us with the past event of the cross in the present through the Spirit?
Yeah. He doesn't say that.
His view of the cross doesn't make sense if you exclude the crucified and risen Jesus. I mean, that's how I would see it. I don't know what others think.
I'm just trying to remember what he talks about elsewhere. But if I remember rightly, and others can correct me, he makes a big deal of the cross being Jesus journeying into the depth of our sin and suffering, and therefore it being a way of God experiencing those things. But he absolutely wants to reject the idea that because of the cross, the any metaphysical distance between God and us has been bridged, because that distance isn't there in the first place, even in our states of sin. Would that be other people's understanding?
We might bow to your reading at the moment.
I really wouldn't do that.
And I'd have to go back and revisit.
But Paul would assert that human beings are alienated from God, wouldn't he? So I don't quite see how that marries with what you're articulating, James. Or I may be misunderstanding what you're saying.
I think I was trying to find the quote in other work just now when we were talking about the rejection of God. But as I understand him, even when we are alienated from God, our existence is still contained within the life of the Trinity, because God does. Paul doesn't see there as being this distance between creator and created in the way that the classic theologians, Aquinas and people would. And so all our existence is contained within the life of the Trinity, and God makes space there so that we can reject him from that place. We can refuse to acknowledge what we are, or what we're created to be. We can reject his grace, but we're still contained within his life, because there is no other place to be.
So you suggest that salvation is only when we acknowledge that we're contained within the divine life?
I think so. I'm not sure we'd phrase it quite like that, but that's my reading of it. And as I say, I may well have completely misunderstood him, but that's my reading of it. It's what Jesus creates. What we see on the cross is an act of love. What God is willing to do for us, and that makes us aware of what could be possible and the life we could be having with God.
It's kind of apocalyptic, I suppose. I think it's an act that then reveals to us the truth of what has happened. Yeah.
As I say, I may have gotten completely wrong.
Is there another aspect of the cross in that Jesus was confronting the powers of his day, those often the misuse and misjudgment of power that were oppressing people, and it was that oppression that was in effect keeping people away from God, not necessarily themselves alienated from God, but the powers that be, both in terms of the religious and the political powers of the day, were preventing people almost from coming into that relationship with God. And was not Jesus in confronting that power and confronting the images of God that were, if you like, the people were alienated from, and that took him to his death? And is there perhaps some mileage in thinking that where people now are confronted or become the victims of oppressive power structures, both in theological, religious, or political terms, or even at oppressed by the powers of the market forces that are all around us? Is it not the case that Jesus is there? That's where Jesus is coming to the cross, is a present reality. And that sense, if we take that, and it doesn't make sense, as I think one of you said about the cross doesn't make sense without the resurrection. It's in that entering into the pain and the suffering where we see the present reality of the cross, but that releasing in us, hopefully, that, if you like, the risen Christ working through people to combat any of those forces that threaten the well-being of humanity, of the planet itself. So there is a past event, but a very real sense of, as we engage in that unlimited grace of God at work in our lives, that is where the present reality of that past event becomes tangible, becomes real. The other thing is that whole question of rejecting God or turning away from God. In my own thinking, and particularly having tried to go back to Calvin and in his institutes, there are images of God there that I would quite easily reject and put on one side. I'm sorry if I stop.
No, I think we're all just taking that in, Brian, and just, yeah. So, yeah, it is. I guess in the chapter, the key bit is this 246. The past event of the cross is thus an objective act of salvation in that it creates response to God's love in the present, overcoming human rebellion towards God, and so it wiping out sin. And it's that creates a response to God's love, is that.
I've just found another quote from Paul, which phrases it slightly differently, which may or may not be helpful, may add something. This is in a different chapter that he's written elsewhere. And he says, the objective power of the cross of Jesus is to transform personalities, to enable them to recognize their relatedness to God and neighbor, and to renew that relation which already exists within the space God makes for creation within a triune life.
Mm.
Mm.
So if that's his view, where does the social justice element, the not social justice so much, but perhaps the reconciling of all things come in? So, because what you've just read out suggests that the cross evokes in individuals a response in which they acknowledge that they are contained within God, and that's the present salvation based on the past event. So, where does the kind of the aspect that involves the cosmos, it involves the world, it involves the reconciling of all things come in his thinking?
I think partly that's the next chapter in one sense, but but my sense is a little bit that what we see in the cross, what we see in Jesus is a revelation of the way that God is, this God who seeks to woo us with his grace, who seeks to make things right, and we're called to kind of, in our participating in the divine life, in participating in the church, we're called to live that out in our own ways of living in that way, which will bring response, which calls us to be concerned about issues of justice and liberty. But we might find more when we read the next chapter. But
Yeah, because I mean, I realise that Paul Fiddes, I mean, he's always talking, isn't he, about the corporate aspect, the communal aspect.
Yeah.
That our participating in God is a together event. It's not a solo dance. It's more than that.
So, what he says on page 246 again is, there's the power of the story of the Passion, a narrative into which the community enters in holy imagination and which shapes its life. So the church should be this cross-carrying community being shaped by the story of the Passion into the world.
Paul did speak at the beginning of the chapter about conversion and looking at Pilgrim's beginning of his progress, but he also refers at other points to that transformation. And I wonder if probably confession it has become a kind of an overworked word, when transformation seems to me to be a much more, I don't know, a more exciting word than conversion. I think in Bebbington's quadrilateral about conversion is I wonder whether transformation is describes what is happening to us when we find ourselves in that orbit, or probably that kind of magnetic flow of Christ's love, and the love and grace of God is not that. And Paul does mention about, rather than a one-off experience, being that journey, and that journey into a continuing transformation. It just another one of those questions. But is there any tangible evidence for a saved life? We can say, I'm saved, I'm born again, I'm all those things. But what is the evidence of that in that saved life? I know that can raise the question of all by faith and not by works, but what is that evidence of someone who has been converted, if you like? And I can go down the pub and find people who appear to be more converted than some of the people in the church, and that probably includes me as well.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating that sorry, Andy.
No, go.
Well, it's fascinating that it's more like social justice in this sense. I mean, on 234, he just makes a tip of the hat to a modern German Baptist confession that connects justification to justice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is actually interesting enough where a lot of the conversation about justification is gone. So the World Communion of Reformed Churches, when they signed on to the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, they made this explicit connection as well. And so there's this connection between the justification of God that God enacts in us through salvation to works of justice in the world. I mean, that's later. Obviously, Paul can't talk about that. That hasn't happened yet. Even the Joint Declaration hasn't happened when this when the original writings had happened. By the time the text came out, the declaration's out, but its real impact hadn't really taken effect in this as this kind of ecumenical moment.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that there's at least a tip of the hat here to justice and justification, which gets a little bit at the sort of fruit of salvation in a way.
Yeah, it'd be good to know what Paul's take on the whole. Should Baptists sign up to that doctrine of the joint doctrine of justification? I would imagine he would say yes.
He does. He does say yes.
But I don't think he's written about it, as far as I know, unless it's in a paper that's not been published. But
no, but we've had some conversations in the BWA about it. And for Paul, it's actually, he thinks the joint declaration, the real insight there is the joining of justification with renewal of life. And so that's sort of this blurring that's happening here, which he uses the language of justification and sanctification here. I think is roughly similar. But the language of the declaration is renewal of life, which I think is more fulsome and has some more implications to it than just, I think sanctification kind of, we're still thinking about sort of timeline kinds of moments, whereas renewal of life has this kind of organic kind of sense to it, I guess. I don't know.
And I think that's a helpful bit where Paul talks about, we need to collapse this distinction between justification and sanctification. I think he's right, and I think people would agree with that. I guess one thing, just looking at, is the question that I might have for Paul is where is resurrection? Where is the resurrection of Christ in all of this? It's very focused on the cross, which is interesting. Like quite a lot of evangelical understandings of atonement and salvation, and Paul, is not an evangelical. He's definitely not a typical evangelical. Also, I think have a problem with the resurrection, as in you could have Jesus not raised, and that their understanding of atonement and salvation would still work. And I guess my question is here is, if Jesus wasn't raised, would that be any problem for Paul's understanding of atonement and salvation? Now, of course, the answer is going to be yes, but I don't know if he spells that out really here in that chapter again. The resurrection is almost muted if absent from this chapter. I did a quick kind of look in the contents, and although we get quite a lot on atonement, we get nothing on resurrection. Which I think sorry.
Well, I was going to say, and related to that is Tim's question about sort of the cosmological sort of ramifications of salvation, right? I mean, a lot of theologians are going to get that out of the impact of the resurrection, and the fact that it's muted here sort of, which is, I mean, honestly, it seems a little odd that Paul isn't talking in that frame, at least to some extent, because of the language of participation, because of this larger than the individual kind of narrative that he's trying to talk about with salvation. It seems as though there would be some kind of larger, whatever word you want to use, cosmological works, but to salvation that's bigger than just the individual, but also just bigger than sort of a gathering of individuals, which is not exactly what we get here, but it's on the ground in a way that's interesting.
But again, I wonder if this does relate again still to my question for Paul, which is, what is his Christology in terms of the person and work of Christ? It's, he wants to take seriously that we need atonement, he wants to take seriously the cross, but what does it mean for Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, the human being of Nazareth, his life, death, and resurrection, and ascension, we might even want to put in there as well. I'm not sure if, part of this makes me want to go back to Past Event and Present Salvation to reread it, and possibly to go to reread The Promised End as well, to see if we get any answers to some of these questions.
Julian said earlier, though, didn't he, that, Julian, forgive me if I'm misquoting you, it's the crucified and risen Jesus that connects us to the cross by the Spirit. I think that was what you said. So I hear what you're saying, Andy. So you're saying that if you just need to look back at the cross as a past event, and then you make your response to God, why do you need a risen Christ in that, in order to find salvation? Julian, I'm sorry, I just wonder, does what you said connect with this?
Well, my recollection is that Paul affirms the reality of the crucified and risen Jesus, and that part of the way in which the past event of the cross bridges into the present human experience of salvation through God's grace is through the presence of the crucified and risen Jesus, who is the one that connects the present experience of God's salvation with the past event of the cross that Jesus endured. I haven't read Past Event and Present Salvation for some time, so I can't say definitively whether that's part of the argument that Paul makes, and I may be remembering from conversations that I've had with Paul in the dim and distant past. But I think in the book Past Event and Present Salvation, Paul is precisely trying to understand how it is that the past event of the cross, which is locked away, if you like, 2,000 years ago in history, makes any kind of difference in the lived present experience of people today. And my recollection is that part of his answer to that is the reality of the crucified and risen Jesus, who bridges that divide, if you like. I may be misremembering my conversations with him, but we can check it out when he comes. But I mean, that would make sense to me, I think, that it is the person of the crucified and risen Jesus who enables a connection to be made with the past event of the cross that he endured and the present experience of salvation that the believer, the church, encounter today.
Yeah.
So I think there's a Christology presupposed in this chapter, even if it's not explicitly spelt out, and the Christology includes the resurrection of Jesus from the dead.
Yeah. There's no way. I'm not suggesting that Paul would ever deny that. I just think it's at least muted here. Yeah, sorry, Brian.
I suppose if we're reading this chapter and concentrating on that whole question of the of salvation in terms of the way in which the cross has been viewed, when it comes to the question of resurrection, one of the things that has been rather bugging me recently is we have, in a sense, placed God on his throne, and with the resurrection and the ascension, we have placed Jesus on the right hand side of God on his throne, and we've almost moved them out of our, if you like, our present journey in terms of transformation. And I wonder if one of the questions one of the answers to the question we're asking, how does Paul relate that death and resurrection as the past event to the present? I would say I'm beginning to find probably something in his thinking. As I say, I'm well into partnership, participation in God, and there, God is not on his throne with his Son at his right hand, and the Holy Spirit sort of just sent to get on with the work. But it's that sort of partnership, that koinonia, if you like, with God in the cosmic dance. And that's what I've been finding particularly exciting, to pursue that. And again, and reading someone like Richard Rohr with his the cosmic dance, the dance of into which we are drawn with the Trinity and with the whole of creation. I find it a bit mind-blowing, but at the same time exciting, and giving me a new lease of life. I can go right back and remember all those immediate post-war struggles between people like the Doctor, Lloyd Jones and John Stott, and all that business, the beginning of charismatic remote. but now I think I'm finding a bit of a second wind before I have to pack up. But I'm sorry, Paul Fiddes. No, Bruce Keeble once said of me in a pastoral session, of course, Brian is garrulous, so I will apologise for my. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Paul is definitely always an interesting theologian to read, even if we don't always agree with him. Tim.
So I get that, and Brian, I absolutely love the idea. It's quite important for my worship life, the idea of participating in God in that way, the cosmic dancer, rather than the bowing before a sort of a very fixed, static throne. I think that my only problem here is, and I know, I mean, I'd never say this to Paul because he'd completely destroy me in an instant in an argument, but it feels like what we're saying is that the resurrection only exists in order to keep, I'm being facile here, in order to keep Jesus alive, in order to provoke a response in us, as opposed to the resurrection being something of objective power over, victory over evil in its moment. Now, so it's that Christus Victor idea. Where does Paul see the resurrection fitting with the defeat of evil, something objective that took place back then? I'm sure he does, but I'm not quite sure it's spelled out here. So I'm just trying to tie this in.
Yeah, and I think we've all got some homework to do to answer some of those questions, or just wait for Paul to turn up, perhaps in our final session. I said earlier that I think the chapter is quite an odd one in the book, but actually perhaps it's quite an important one, because the question of salvation and atonement is such a it's an important one for all Christians, but perhaps for Baptists as well, with our emphasis on saving faith and that kind of looking for a response, that personal response to God. So maybe this chapter is definitely, we should be definitely glad that it's there. Yeah. I'm conscious of time. And I think we've had quite a good conversation about this chapter, raising lots of it. I think it does perhaps take us to an engagement with Paul's wider work to pick up some of the questions that we might have, to work out whether it was something Julian read or something was shared by Paul with Julian. We shall see. So we'll leave it there, and we'll pick up next month if you're around for his chapter on mission and liberty, which I think picks up lots of questions around justice and again, when A Fresh Shift was written for Paul, it was called For the Love of God, and it focused on the doctrine of God. And again, I think to read Paul is to see how his doctrine of God is so important, which is his doctrine of the Trinity. And right there in the creative suffering of God, we see something of what it is. And I think that will play out in this chapter as it has done, and will play out definitely in the next chapter on mission and liberty. So, thank you.
Thank you.